Thank you very much, Leanna. So, hey everyone, welcome to the first public event in the series, The Past is Present, New Montagnard Artists. My name is Andrew Young, today's host. Today's presentation is an author's talk with Rena DeTroy, a Montagnard American writer living in Brooklyn, New York. She is the creator of an upcoming online workshop, Apocalypse Never, Writing Our Stories and Imaginative Futures as Montagnard Americans. Rena was selected for the Café Royale Cultural Foundation Winter 2020 Grant in Literature and the 2019 Emerging Writer Fellowship at Aspen Word in Memoir. Roxane Gay, the noted writer, selected her essay entitled The Vengeance of Elephants for the 2017 Kurt Johnson Prose in Creative Nonfiction by the literary journal December magazine. Her personal essay, Not, was published in the anthology Borderlands and Crossroads, Writing the Motherland by feminist publisher Demeter Press. So this is a really exciting event. Let me get through a couple of other bits of boilerplate here and to tell you that this project is made possible by funding provided by the Creative Greensboro, the Office of Arts and Culture of the City of Greensboro, through a Catalyzing Creativity Grant. And a big shout out to Montagnard Dega Association and its youth branch, Montagnard American Organization, for applying for the grant. Please check out the chat section for links to our Facebook page and our author's information too. This evening's program structure will consist of the featured artist presentation. At 6:15, we'll break for questions. If you'd like to use the chat feature to ask questions or to make comments, please do. We also will invite your live questions on camera at that time as well. I put some links into chat, as I've already mentioned. So with that, getting all past that stuff, and now it's with great pleasure that I turn things over to this evening's artist, Rena DeTroy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Liana. Thank you, Creative Greensboro. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you for the workshop participants who have logged in. I'm so excited to start. We start on Wednesday, actually. So I'm like getting the syllabus together, and that's super exciting. And I can't wait to see the writing that comes out for the workshop, Apocalypse Never, Writing Our Origin Stories and Imaginative Futures as Montagnard Americans. I have to write it. I have it written up on this Google Doc next to Zoom because it's a mouthful, and sometimes I say apocalypse now and I don't want to say apocalypse now. So yes, it's Apocalypse Never. So I am going to read an excerpt of The Vengeance of Elephants for folks who have not heard it yet. Okay, so I will just start. If at any point I am hard to hear because maybe I will be looking down or something, just someone please pipe up and let me know. Okay. All right, make sure these don't fall down. The Vengeance of Elephants. In 300 AD, Vietnamese warrior heroine Tru Thi Trinh fought invading Chinese soldiers of the Wu dynasty. She was also called Lady Tru, and legend claimed she was 9 feet tall and had 3 breasts, each a meter long, that she tied behind her back when she rode an elephant into battle. If you can believe that after death, a soul implodes into shining light to recycle into a new life over and again, then it's possible that my mother has a few smoldering particles of Lady Tru in her. My mother, Nehanyap, kept a spear behind the front door of the Red House in Connecticut. Close by was my little league slugger bat and a brick on the windowsill, just in case she needed to battle. On summer afternoons, sun speckling down a hillside of trees, I'd watch my mother trim hedges skirting the sidewalk. Her skin was the hue of burnt sugar, and from her jerky movements of her barely 5-foot frame, I knew she was buzzed on Carla Rosie, sweetened with grape juice. Stance-wide, an orange hedge cutter cocked and whirring at the hip, my mother reminded me of Rambo and his machine gun, mowing down rebel green shoots. French and American military used words like fierce, pugnacious, and natural fighters to describe my mother's people, the Montagnards, an indigenous ethnic minority from Vietnam's mountainous Central Highlands. Perhaps this was getting to my head. I had resorted to an old issue of National Geographic magazine on the Vietnam War. At the Red House, we had a stack of these magazines, their bright yellow spines next to my mother's vinyl record collection of mostly Elvis. On the cover of the April 1968 issue, a boy splashed out of the water with a silvery fish in his mouth. As a child, puzzling over this image many times, I wondered if he had caught the fish in his mouth, or if he was eating it raw. When I was older, I understood this boy was Montagnard, half me, although what that meant was unclear. I had never seen our faces or names in television, movies, or books. School texts had a few passages on the Vietnam War, and I understood vaguely that my mother came to the United States from that. But nothing on the Montagnards. Besides this issue of National Geographic, we were unseen. In my late teens, I picked up this issue again, determined. I scanned the text for women. I was hungry for any indication of who my mother was before she fled, before an airplane lifted her into the sky as Saigon burned and blistered into chaos below. Instead of women, I found Montagnard men, portrayed on the sidelines as stoic and unreadable supporting characters to the Americans. They acted rash in mounting bold raids, sudden attacks, and switching loyalties, all while never having much to say. Better depictions were poetic passages to noble savages, or preliterate modern-day hunters and gatherers stuck in the Bronze Age. Lady True led an army of 1,000 from the mountains. I imagined they were my mother's tribe, us. We were known to tame and race elephants. Considering our aggressive reputation, wouldn't we also ride them into battles? I often wondered what would happen if an enemy invader came to the front door of the Red House. Was my mother planning on knocking someone out with a bat or crushing a skull with a brick? Would she grab a spear, wind her arm back, and launch it like a javelin? Would she wield it like a bayonet? The absurdity in this is not that the spear was too rusty or dull, or that I cannot picture her doing such a thing. What was absurd was she seemed to believe a boogeyman existed, dripping with such conspicuous evil that she would reflexively fight back with her stash of weaponry. The truth is, all threats came from people she invited into our house and into her heart openly. She had been duped and she had been robbed. Having been betrayed, she seemed to believe that only weapons could protect her. Some historians believe Lady True lost her mother and father to pillaging invaders. Avenging blood aloft an elephant, she aimed for where to lay the hurt with one clean sweep of her bludgeon. So that's one section, and I'm just going to go ahead to this other short section. So this is the beginning of section 2. When I looked closer at the 1968 issue of National Geographic magazine, I found women. I had not acknowledged them initially. For the story, Vietnam's Montagnards, Caught in the Jaws of War, photojournalist Howard Socherek wrote that an elderly woman he met along a jungle path was shriveled. I looked away. When an American missionary told Socherek that Montagnard women in the village inquired if he'd take a wife, and all they wanted was to make him happy, I resisted seeing them too. I needed to see our multitudes as women, as Montagnards. I needed depictions beyond victims of war. I wanted them to be bold and dignified. My unwillingness to see them was bound up with my privilege. I needed them to have choices and convictions they'd fight for. To want more for them was a sign I couldn't accept them or their reality. Yet paradoxically, how could I want anything else? I'd have to accept less for myself, this line of thinking seemed to imply. Yet, when I looked closer, I found her. In a portrait of a handsome Montagnard chief, whom was charged with collaborating against the Americans, there was a photo caption in tiny print. The last sentence read, "His sister remains with the Viet Cong and operates in a unit only a few miles away." She may have been impressed into forced labor by the Viet Cong, but she was just as likely, but just, but it was just as likely she chose the BVC. Regardless, I filled in the blanks, my mind arrested in picturing her working quietly in the margins for something she wanted. In the battle against the Wu soldiers from China, Lady True's brother, begged her to save herself and surrender. History recorded her response, her most famous words: "I want to track storms, ride hazardous waves, hunt sharks in the open sea, expel the invaders, restore the country, untie servitude, and never descend to be someone's concubine." And yet, she was erased. In Chinese accounts, history written by the victors, there was no mention of her. Only on the Vietnamese side of history do we know that she rode into battle fearlessly, her army outnumbered and overpowered, death imminent. So that's that.
So, wow. Rena, thank you. I've been tasked with asking you questions, I guess, to try to make this into a kind of an interview. But so how, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions, I guess, because I'm really moved by what you're writing, what you're saying. Let me ask you, you're talking about Lady True, and you're also looking at the National Geographic magazines. And I think when I read your essay, you had said that as a young person, you missed seeing the women in the pictures, as well as maybe in the actual written narrative. And so I guess what I'm getting at is this idea of you as an author seeing these things now, and in contrast, the invisibility you when you didn't see the women when you looked at these magazines when you were young, and you talk about the lady heroine who kind of disappears. She's not written into history. She's invisible but discovered. Can you say something about, I don't know, this idea of invisibility and suddenly seeing, or seeing? What does that mean to you as an author?
Yeah. I mean, I think that so much of writing is about fighting against that invisibility. I think it's, probably one of the things that compelled me to write. I mean, as a young person, I don't know, perhaps, I mean, I just wrote because I thought writing was fun. But I think as I got older, and, I think I had looked for, people like my mother on the page and people like me, in books so much, that, at some point, I think I just subconsciously I started writing, and in a way to fight against that. And then at some point, I became more conscious that I was doing that. Like I am consciously um, putting myself on the page. And I guess what's interesting about, books and about just kind of this externalization of um, who you are, which, I think what art is about, or is what, compels a lot of artists, is to externalize your internal world and to see it kind of reflected, like to kind of, you know, have it become a mirror that you look at, and reflects you. And um, yeah, I mean, ultimately, I will say that like I obviously needed role models, um, and I don't know. I don't think I could really point to a lot of role models um, that I really identified with. I mean, I don't know. I was into like a lot of like grunge and like alternative music, and there were some like really awesome like um, female musicians that were tough and amazing, and so they were role models when I was a teenager. But yeah, I was really starving
Can you name a
for
few? Can you name a few of your grunge heroes?
the Breeders. Um, I mean, now I'm like dating myself. Yeah, so the Breeders were one. I mean, like the I guess the Deal Sisters. They were both bass players. Um, Sonic Youth, uh, Luscious Jackson. Um, who else? I mean, like I think it's the guitarist of Smashing Pumpkins.
Mhm.
Or no, she's the bass player of Smashing Pumpkins. Um, so I mean, that was kind of like the closest. Those were like the people that I gravitated towards. Like as a teenager, I was like, okay, these women. I think they reflect the kind of angst that um, I very much have inside of me. Um, but yeah, I mean, I also well, so I enrolled into like an Asian American literature course. I think my second year in college, and that is when I actually saw people who not only, I guess, would look like my mother and me, but like their complicated relationship um, that was so complex, and like at sometimes like I mean I just had never seen such complex relationships articulated in books and onto the page. And when I read other Asian American writers, um, it was the first time I realized like I wasn't alone with my very complex struggles with my mom.
You write in Vengeance of the Elephants about trying to become a journalist, and I guess this is still on the theme of the role model and becoming, I guess, who you are, a writer, but becoming, right?
Mm-hmm.
Can you say something about? I think you mentioned something about a journalism professor that you highly respected. Can you say something? Can you tell that story and talk about how that connects to maybe roles and becoming visible and becoming who you are?
Yeah, so in The Vengeance of Elephants, I talk about going to journalism school, which was a decision after I went to Vietnam. Um, and after I just learned more about the Montagnard experience in Vietnam, I realized that there was a story that was, really complex, really, there was all types of just kind of like political oppression, and it was underreported. And so that was one of the reasons why I decided to go to journalism school, which we call J school in the first place. I had a journalism professor who I respected deeply, and we struggled. I mean, from like day one, we struggled. But yes, at some point, every single day we are given like all these tasks, all these, we have to write different stories. And, I think I didn't do well in most of them. Partially because I think I had so much training as kind of I had different writing training up at that point. I had gone to the New School for creative writing also, and I was writing more in a literary way, and then I was being retrained to write like a journalist, and so that shift was
Yeah,
difficult.
just what, so what do you need to do to be a, a bona fide journalist? What were you not doing? That you weren't that thing. What was that? Could you explain that?
Yeah, well, I kept putting myself in the story, which is very much not how you're supposed to do journalism. As a journalist, you're supposed to like kind of disappear into the background. You're like this all-seeing eye. You're reporting everything that's happening as if you don't exist. But at no point are you really supposed to make an I statement. You can't say I observed this or I saw that. I mean, sometimes journalists do that, but you're supposed to do it rarely. Um, I think the training I got before that, or just what I had learned before that, was very much about kind of these different artistic modes where I could, there was gonzo journalism, which I thought was really interesting, which is like Hunter S. Thompson, who writes very kind of like stream of conscious, and is doing journalism, but is very much part of the story. Um, so I did a gonzo journalist exercise when, in fact, I think my teacher wanted something else. And he was like, this is terrible. Like, you have failed you, you know, and he's like, you failed this exercise, but not only that, but you're in the danger of failing this entire course. Um, and he's like, you need to take yourself out of the story. And while I understood like what that meant, um, because I understood that journalism was one thing and creative writing was another thing, there was something about our whole rapport, and there was something about his whole kind of stance, and hearing those words, you need to take yourself out of the story. No one cares about what you think. No one cares about who you are. Like that was, those words like shook me in a way. And I'll say that like journalism, at some point, I recognized that journalism was not the best format for me. I had to at some point recognize that my work was stronger when I was part of the story. Um, so I went back into creative writing, and then I got an MFA in creative writing and memoir specifically, just acknowledging the fact that, like, you know, to be a Montagnard American writer and to erase yourself from the story is to do a disservice to myself, um, but perhaps also my community.
Um, yeah, I do appreciate what you're saying. It almost sounds as if the journalism, the requirements of journalism was a step backwards into this invisibility that vengeance of the elephants is all not about. It's about
Right.
becoming visible.
Right.
So can you tell the folks here who's listening in, what is the Montagnard American experience? What does that actually? I mean, you write very well about it, and we've talked about it as well. But
Mm-hmm.
can you put it into I don't know. I'm not going to say 5 words, but can you condense it in I don't know, in a, yeah,
Yeah.
see what you can do with that.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I am a writer specifically for the reason that I'm a better writer than I am a speaker. But I will say that, I mean, I think it's hard to sum up what the Montagnard American experience is. I think it's, but I will say that it's important. And I think what most people may not know is that it's very different from, for example, the Vietnamese American experience. Like, we don't have this experience of being like rescued from boats, for example. In the 1980s, um, a small group of refugees came over uh, by plane, and they were in refugee camps in Thailand, and later they were in refugee camps in Cambodia. And that smaller group was then joined by larger groups, and that is, from what I know, what makes up like the largest concentration of Montagnards outside of Southeast Asia in North Carolina. Um, I live in Connecticut, or I was born in Connecticut. My mother still lives in Connecticut. I live in New York. Uh, my mother came over in 1975. Not, I mean, not as not in that same refugee experience. Like she shares the experience of being exiled, but she doesn't necessarily share that refugee experience. Um, I mean, I think the Montagnard experience, the Montagnard American experience, is one that, you know, I'm ready, but I can't fully define, which is definitely one of the reasons why I think Apocalypse Never, like this workshop, is so important. I think people will read my work and they'll relate to some of the things that I say, but I don't think they'll relate to everything as far as like other Montagnard Americans, which is all the more reason why we need more voices to make their way to the page. We need more Montagnard Americans to write, more Montagnard Americans to get published. Um, I mean, it's hard to say like what the Montagnard American experience is because it hasn't been written really. Um, there's these kind of bullet points about like, you know, the refugee camps and coming over and this and that, but um, I think, I think that our experience is different from the Asian American experience. I think it might have more similarities with other Southeast Asian Americans, like Cambodian Americans, Lao Americans. Um, but, all the more reason that we have to put our voices out there.
Right. I think that's well said. So we talked about some ideas of how this exchange today would go. The name Apocalypse Never. I'm guessing, because this part I didn't really talk to you at great length, but I'm just guessing here. I think that many in the audience know the Francis Ford Coppola. It's a 1979 movie, Apocalypse Now. I do remember it when it came out, so that dates me as well. Obviously, the movie has taken on a real mythic reputation. We'll say as an art piece, and because it's based on the novel of Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. So, is there something that bothers you about that movie? We for technical reasons we could not fulfill your request to show some clips from the movie, but maybe you can paint that picture and take it from this point about this particular movie and the riff on the title.
Yeah. I mean, so Apocalypse Now, what is the first time I've seen Montagnard on film. Um, Granted, I will say that my mother did not allow war films in our house growing up whatsoever. So I don't know if there's Montagnards in Deer Hunter or Rambo. There might be, but um, yeah, I don't know about that. But yes, as far as the first time I've ever seen Montagnards, it's been in Apocalypse Now. And there is that scene where it's Willard, who is Martin Sheen, or Martin Sheen plays Captain Willard. I think he's a captain. Um, Anyways, he's trying to hunt Colonel Kurtz, who is this rogue colonel who is deep in the jungle and is basically leading his own war against the North Vietnamese, even though the Americans at this point are beginning to pull out, and they don't approve of anything that he's doing. So Willard is on this riverboat, and they're going up this river, and the part that's based on the Heart of Darkness is when like this fusillade of arrows come flying out, arrows and spears. Um, and then at some point you know you see this like all these people in like loincloths and like the black vests, which is a traditional Montagnard clothing. Um, they're like there's all these folks in mass, and they're actually Filipinos who are the actors, and I think they're at Siem Reap, which is that place in Cambodia. Anyways, so they're in mass on the shore looking at this riverboat, and it is like the ultimate kind of like. Well, I'll also say that there are bodies hanging from trees, and then there's like heads on the ground. So there's like all this like really gruesome, like all these just images of violence and like gruesome death and war. Um, it's a pretty hard scene to watch. The entire movie is pretty difficult to watch. Um, but anyways, I mean, it's like the stereotype of the savage. It's the stereotype of like the exotic other. Um, and I think that, I'm going to have a piece being published in Diacritics where I talk about this workshop, but I also talk about how, in the 1950s, there were already Montagnards from different tribes organizing pan ethnically um, for uh, you know land rights.
Right, for basically for more rights and more freedoms.
Yeah, for land rights, for like political rights. They wanted to be a larger part of like the Vietnamese political process, and for they wanted their languages taught in schools. Um, you know, and they organized, and they had delegations, and they went to other delegations, and they organized further, and like you know really, it's if you think about that, you know it's a very kind of like unglamorous, boring image of people organizing for their rights, in a very kind of pedestrian and normal way. It's completely different compared to the depiction that happens 20 years later when Coppola makes this film in 1979. Obviously, you know, showing Montagnards organizing in this kind of very like unglamorous and boring way is not going to sell movie tickets in the way that shows them with hanging bodies and spears and arrows. But I think like what's interesting about that is that like, you know, why is it that we need these images of like stereotypical exotic others and savages in order to sell movie tickets? I mean, like, what does that say about Americans, and what does that say about the West? That those are the images that are needed in order to, I guess, portray this story about the Vietnam War.
So part of it sounds like to me, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that part of the Montagnard American experience is navigating the past, is looking at how the past has been depicted, including in Hollywood movies, where, as you say, they call them Montagnards in the movie. They're wearing the vests, but they're played by Filipino actors, and they're up in Cambodia. So they're in the wrong place with the wrong people, depicting everything in a completely Hollywood fabricated kind of way,
Right.
which makes, arguably great art, but
Hmm.
it disconnects totally from what you understand as the lived experience of Montagnards in the past,
Yeah.
and then trying to figure out here in the present for you as a writer. Is that kind of getting at what you're saying?
Yeah. I mean, and I also just say that, like, if there had if there were many more depictions of Montagnard Americans since then, you know, I suppose in that war context, but then afterwards, and maybe doing even like regular things, having, regular family experiences, things like that, then, I probably wouldn't be picking on Apocalypse Now. But the fact is that, like, it's what, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, um, you know, the incredible Nigerian writer says is like the danger of the single story.
Mm-hmm.
You
Mm-hmm.
know, like we have been depicted so infrequently that the only depiction that we have is like this really, kind of Orientalist and racist bullshit depiction that doesn't show our other sides of humanity. Um, so yeah, I mean, as far as like the past, I mean, the past is obviously, the past is alive with us, and specifically because we're not engaging. There's no context to who we are now that is like that. There's no pop culture representation. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, Andrew, but
Yeah, no, I mean, it's terrific what you're saying. I really appreciate it. A question that's come to my mind about as you're describing, as you're critiquing Apocalypse Now and why it's really should be, I think, correctly as you're saying, Apocalypse Never. Um, it, is it is it a burden, or is it a perception that you have as a writer, as a Montagnard American, that that life or history, or it only exists as kind of like here in America and then in the past the war? Is it very, that's it seems cruel to have a history either defined by you by Hollywood or whoever else, which it consists of only of, well, there was the Vietnam War, and then maybe there's this interim period of being a refugee in Southeast Asia, but then, but it's a it's a very uncomplicated and very simplistic sort of narrative. Is that correct, or do you have that feeling?
yeah, I mean, it's one dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't show our many dimensions. I mean, um, and there's just so much more. I mean, you live in, North Carolina in Greensboro, and so like you are, and a lot of the folks that are in the audience are much more familiar with just the wide nuance of the Montagnard American experience and our history. And it's just like, why can't we see that? Why can't we reflect on that? Why is that not portrayed? And I think we get used to the fact that, like, oh well, we're just like this kind of small ethnic minority, and maybe we don't deserve the spotlight. Maybe we don't deserve movies or books. I mean, I think that's dangerous thinking. You know, and I think if anything, that's like centering a certain kind of dominant narrative that is just ultimately not going to serve us. You know, if anything, I mean, there's lots of folks all over the world whose stories are not being told. Um, there's lots of ethnic minorities all over the world whose stories are not being told. Um, but instead of just being like, well, what do you expect? I think instead, it's important to say, well, no, we're going to actually invest time and money into these stories, because it's part of, I mean, it's part of the human condition, number one. But I think it's also part of like humanizing uh, the folks who are the most invisible and therefore like the most vulnerable, and often just marginalized through war, or poverty or all the other things. Like we have to confront as a society how we treat those who are vulnerable. Um, in order to like live up to all the things that we like to say, makes us great as America.
So on that, I want to put in a plug for the city of Greensboro, which gave MDA this grant, The Past is Present, new Montagnard American artists. And I wanted to spend at least 1 minute and let you talk about the workshop. What are your hopes for the workshop? I think you said you've already filled it up already. Can you just say a little bit about that? And then afterwards, we'll open up for questions. And I really hope that we've got some questions coming from folks who've been patiently listening in. But something about the workshop that you'll be holding.
Yeah, so the workshop, it starts on Wednesday. It is a kind of an introductory creative writing workshop, that is also about just stimulating creativity. We are going to be looking at like historical texts that are a bit dry, but we are going to like look at them in a creative way and figure out ways to kind of interact and engage with them, that makes history come alive. We're also going to be looking at books, and I have them here. We have Edenair Neeraj's book, Homeland, and then we also have Escaping Vietnam, Hayoin's story. So, what is really cool is that her daughter is actually going to be taking the workshop. So,
oh, wow.
I'm super excited about that, and it's possible we may get Hyoin to visit our workshop. Yeah, but the idea is that we're going to just engage with our history, but also kind of activate our creativity and our imagination for the future. I do have one exercise where we're going to talk about the Montagnard experience from the future, as if it's the year 3033.
Wow.
And
wow.
so, I mean, I have a lot of, go ahead.
No, this, I don't mean to cut you off. I want to, I'm sort of cueing our audience. And I hope people who have questions will turn on their cameras and so on. But I'm very, very excited to see you, published author, living up there in Brooklyn, New York. You're saying, well, I'm not down here in North Carolina, but there's a lot of nice things going on in Brooklyn. But having this ability, I understand that the workshop is full, but I also hope that this is a leverage point for MDA and an understanding of the city that there is in fact a demand for something like this. So we wait with bated breath. If I can now, I'm hoping that we've got some questions coming from folks. I don't see anything in the chat here, and Leanna helped me out, but we really want to encourage folks to be taking advantage of our amazing writer here to get some questions in. So do we have some questions?
I keep talking.
We want the audience here to do some work, and I'm recognizing some people who without naming their names, they should have questions.
I have a question.
Go ahead, please.
Hi.
Yes, hello. I haven't read your book, but I look forward to reading it. And I teach in peace and conflict studies, and I think the story that you tell speaks to the I think the field as well so strongly. but women generally are very invisible in war and the history of war. And I think what you are doing is fascinating. I applaud your work, and also the fact that you are doing when you are so young is I think important, and also mentoring and inspiring others. But I'm also very interested in agency, your agency and your parents' agency. How did you come to that? I think you touched upon it, but I'm very interested more about relationship with your mom. What were your like turning moments in that life and exercise of your own agency, and perhaps also in relation to your mom? And
Yeah, I mean, I will say that, well, okay, so I did just do a podcast with Liana, who is on here. Hi. um, and so that's like fresh in my mind, kind of like the discussion that we had. My mother, uh, in so many ways, was um, a rebel herself. Um, you know, she and I did not get along. We had a really combative relationship growing up, to the point that I moved to live with my father, my white father, when I was 12. Um, you know, and so for the longest time, I'll say as a teenager, I will say that I really struggled with my mother. I had a hard time even feeling like I loved her because our struggle was so deep and it was so hurtful and it was so painful. Um, as I got older, and by the way, I just turned 40, so I'm not that young. Um, yeah, so as I got older, I obviously saw and understood like my mother's struggles a lot more. And I got to understand that I think a lot of our struggle has to do with the fact it had to do with education. It had the fact to do with like I got an education. I got up, I went to public school in America. Uh, and then I went to college and I got master's degrees. Um, and I kind of pieced this together. My mother has a lot of resentment against her cousin, who also was allowed to get a college degree, and she was not allowed. And he was male, and so it made sense that he got to go. Like the family resources would be invested in him to go to college, and not her. I've also like spoken to people who knew my mother way back when. A lot of Vietnam vets, in fact, and they were just like, your mom was she was so vivacious and she was so curious. Like she was, you know, her mind was very much alive. Um, and I think that like, in so many ways, like, uh, because she's a woman, her education was not prioritized. Um, then there was the war. And besides the fact this was in a time period in which like Montagnards were not really they didn't always have access to education. So when I was growing up, she really resented me for reading and for doing well in school. I mean, and it's very much the opposite kind of like the model minority experience. Like a lot of people think that the Asian American experience is like you have a tiger mom who's like, you can't have friends and you're going to play, practice piano and do all your homework and XYZ. That was very much not my experience. My mother seemed threatened by me reading and by me being a good student. Um, so yeah, I mean, that to me has like changed the narrative for me because like I understand that. Like if I were in her shoes, I would be enraged as well. Like I am enraged by any idea that like any notion that I cannot get the education and explore my curiosity as much as I want. I mean, that has guided a lot of my life choices, in fact. Um, so, and I'll just say that, like, I think that's one of the reasons why my mother left. And I think that's one of the reasons why my mother actually, I think, very, I don't know if deliberately is the word, but I think she separated herself from the traditional Montagnard community because she wanted to define herself. And I think there was that trauma of being denied her education that, um, just made her who she is. And as far as agency goes, I mean, as I was saying in the podcast, like, she, when we went down to North Carolina, one of these times I brought my mother to North Carolina, and I just saw how, like, she just kind of really struggled to kind of like interact. Like, I think she felt very othered in the Montagnard community. I mean, granted, she didn't know folks. She knew some folks. She, I mean, she met some people who she knew from way back when, um, which I'm sure has a lot to do with it. But I think, and you see this for a young woman or for women who are trying to make their way, you know, sometimes traditional communities are the source of a tremendous amount of trauma. Or just communities are just a source of a tremendous amount of trauma and kind of oppression that, like, you just separate yourself. And I think the fact that my mother separated herself and basically defines her own life in so many ways has given me a lot of permission to do the same for my life.
You, when you mentioned that, you rang a bell in my head because my mother grew up in New York City's Chinatown, and surrounded by, back then it was a very small community, but it was suffocating, and
Yeah.
my mom couldn't wait to move. She, the
Yeah.
war happened, the World War II, and they were able to move out to the suburbs and all that.
Yep.
But they just wanted to get away. Um,
Yeah.
We've got a little bit of time here. I see that Fun's got a question, so I'm going to see if Fun can turn on her camera and ask her question here.
I have one too when you get a chance.
Yeah, definitely. Let's kind of move along here. Fun, can you ask your question, please, and then we'll get to Larry's?
Sure. I have two questions for you, Harina. First of all, thank you for your time this evening. And my two questions for you are, what kind of advice would you give to Montagnard or folks who identify as Montagnard Indigenous who want to begin writing or sharing their story but don't really know where to start? And then my second question is, what is your personal dream for your stories and your storytelling?
Oh, that's such a great question. I would say that if you want to be a writer, just, take courses. There's a lot of stuff available on the internet that can kind of point you in the direction to how to strengthen your work. But I'm also a big proponent of just putting yourself out there. Just start submitting to writing contests or to magazines or what have you. I think, similar to my experience when I was first starting out, you'll be surprised how many people are receptive, and also just like you can get good feedback from just submitting your work. I mean, I will also say that, like, sometimes a writing practice, where you're like working actively on specific essays or stories can be difficult. I would say that, at least keeping a journal, just getting into the habit of speaking to yourself on the page and just, there's a great book called The Artist's Way, and it's Julia Cameron and lots of people, it's super famous. Anyways, she says that every morning when you wake up, You need to write 3 pages. And you can't let, the pen cannot stop. You just have to write. And it's amazing. I mean, you're allowed to also, like, you're allowed to be like, I hate this, I hate this, I hate this. This is boring. I don't know what else to write. This is, I need to go pick up, whatever groceries. It can become a list. That's totally fine. But the point is, there is supposedly, it's almost like spiritual. After 3 pages, you break through that kind of neurotic, executive brain function that is telling you all the things that you need to do, and you get to a space where art can come out.
And I don't mean to cut you off, but I know we want to get in at least 2 more questions, and we're running out of time.
Okay.
We are going to hopefully have you come back, or have some of your writers in the workshop come on back. But if I can just interrupt you so we can get
Yes.
Larry's question in. Larry, do you want to take it away?
Yes, mine is not so much a question. First of all, I want to congratulate you on your successes and applaud you on applying those energies that got you there. You make me feel good, because this is something I've wanted for some time, is to hear the Montagnard stories come out. I had the pleasure of living in a Montagnard village for about 3 months in early 1962. And
Wow.
those were not pictures of savages. Those were some of the most awesome people I'd ever met in my life. I still remember them. I've never forgotten them the whole time. I'm a writer too. I didn't start writing until I was 73. I've published six books, 3 of which are historical fiction.
Great.
My first book was my story of Vietnam and my time in the Montagnard village, which to me was the most important part of the book. But no question from you, just keep on doing what you're doing.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you so much, Larry. I think, Leanna, you've got a question coming from Facebook, and that'll be our last question for today.
Yes, Harina, thank you so much for sharing your experience with your mom. So Melina Kasor is in Greensboro, North Carolina. If you haven't met her, she shared that she struggled she had the same struggle with her mom. And then she said that I don't think our parents carry a lot of trauma. I think our parents carry a lot of trauma that they don't mean to intentionally project into us. Do you feel that there are ways we can begin this conversation and unraveling these barrier emotion?
I mean, one of the things that I am planning for this workshop is to address, what Edenair did, which is he is ghostwriting essentially for his father. So he engaged in conversations with his dad about his story. Granted, his father was super open and excited to share, and that's not the case with my mother. It's like pulling teeth when I ask her about her stories. But I do, part of the workshop is giving the participants ideas on how to have those conversations with their folks, with their parents. I think that, I think that sometimes they will come easier and sometimes they will be really difficult. But generally speaking, like, the most important thing is that we just create as many spaces for connection. I mean, I want to thank you, Liana, because I see that, I mean, just MDA and MOA in general, I see that you guys are creating a lot of talks and a lot of spaces for different ways of interacting. And I think that is just so amazing. And just, I wish I wish my mother and I had that growing up. I wish my mother, my sister, and I had that growing up. Spaces where we can talk about difficult things in kind of a communal way. So yeah, and I will also just say, as far as my personal dream for storytelling, which was Fun's last question I didn't get to, I'm hoping that, like, I am going to be editing some stories for publication, some Montagnard stories through this workshop, but also some of the writers that we already have, I'm hoping to make more of those opportunities for writers, and I'm hoping at some point we have an anthology. That's the big goal here, at least one anthology.
And with that, we thank you so much. We need to wrap up and stay on time. You can reach Rena with more questions and comments. I guess I'm going to say at her website, at which we posted in chat. So
yeah, I mean, I'll also just put my email.
Yeah, please do. And while you're doing that, we will let people know, stay tuned for our next event in the series, The Past is Present, New Montagnard Artists. That is scheduled for Wednesday, not a Friday, but Wednesday, March 10th from 5:30 to 6:30, same time slot, featuring visual artist Sachi Deli. She'll be talking about Through Indigenous Eyes, painted reflections of the Montagnard American experience. She is a visual artist. And you can find the latest information on the Facebook page, Past Present, which we've also put into chat. So with that, we want to wish everyone a great evening and good night. So we're wrapping up now. So once again, thank you so much, folks.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.